There is a place on this earth right now where they are building a city so big, so secret, and so heavily guarded that people have been shot dead just for refusing to leave it. A place where the mountains have been hollowed out from the inside, where underground canals lead into hidden cities carved into rock, where F-15 fighter jets roar above the desert every single day, and where one of the most powerful military positions in the entire Middle East sits quietly behind glass walls and luxury hotels. The Saudi government calls it the future. They call it a dream. They call it the greatest city ever built. But underneath every single press release, underneath every glittering digital render, underneath every bold promise about sustainability and innovation, something else is happening, something they are not putting in the brochure. And once you understand the location, the history, the underground structures, the tribal blood that has already been spilled, and the wars that are already burning just a few hundred kilometers away, you will never look at this megacity the same way again. This is the story of NEOM. And this story is not what you think it is. In 2017, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stood before the world and announced something that sounded more like science fiction than a construction project. He announced that Saudi Arabia would build a brand new city from scratch, not just any city. A city that would cover 26,500 square kilometers of empty northwestern desert. A city that would cost $500 billion to build. A city with no cars, no roads, no carbon emissions, and no limits. He called it NEOM, a word that blends the ancient Greek word for new with the Arabic word for future, new future. That is what he told the world this place would be. The centerpiece of NEOM is something called the Line, and the Line is exactly what it sounds like. A single straight city, 170 kilometers long, 500 meters tall, and only 200 meters wide, running like a razor blade through the desert and into the mountains, and down to the edge of the Red Sea. It has no beginning and no end that a normal person could walk between in a single day. It is not a city built outward. It is a city built upward. Two massive mirrored walls facing each other with an entire world built inside them. Homes, parks, schools, trains, hospitals, shops, all within a structure so tall it would make the Burj Khalifa look like a low-rise apartment building. 9 million people were supposed to live inside it. 9 million. All of them in one straight line. No traffic lights, no streets, no exhaust fumes. Just one perfect, gleaming, futuristic corridor stretching across the Saudi landscape like something out of a dream. And for a few years, the world was amazed. The architects were amazed. The investors were amazed. The global media was amazed. Every time a new render dropped, a new digital image of what the Line would look like, millions of people clicked and watched and shared and said, wow. Fertile. And that is exactly what Saudi Arabia wanted. It wanted your eyes on the glass. It wanted your attention on the luxury. It wanted your mind spinning with questions about robots and renewable energy and ski resorts in the desert. Because while your eyes were locked on the Line, something else was quietly being built around it, beneath it, and into the mountains behind it. Something that the press releases never mentioned. Something that any military analyst, geopolitical expert, or historian would immediately recognize the moment they looked at a map. Because here is the thing about NEOM that the marketing never tells you. It is not built on empty land. It is not built in some forgotten corner of the desert that nobody ever cared about. NEOM is built in Tabuk province, and Tabuk province is one of the most strategically important military locations in the entire history of Saudi Arabia. Tabuk sits in the northwestern corner of Saudi Arabia, pressed right up against the border with Jordan, looking across the Gulf of Aqaba toward Egypt, and positioned within striking distance of Israel. This is not coincidence. This has never been coincidence. Tabuk has been a military nerve center for decades, and the United States government knew it, and was so worried about it that in 1978, when the Saudis wanted to buy American F-15 fighter jets, the Pentagon forced Saudi Arabia to sign a written promise that they would never base those jets at Tabuk. The U.S. Defense Secretary at the time put it in a letter to Congress. He said, and I want to be clear about this, the Saudis signed paperwork specifically because Tabuk was considered too sensitive, too close to too many borders, too powerful a military position to be left unchecked. That is how strategically important this location has always been. Whether or not that was the primary intention, the dual-use potential is undeniable. And then there is Oxagon. Oxagon is NEOM's floating industrial city, positioned directly on the Red Sea, designed to be the largest floating industrial complex ever built. It has its own port. It has its own fully automated crane systems, the first remote-controlled ship-to-shore cranes ever deployed in Saudi Arabia. The port is already operational and already serving as what NEOM calls a critical gateway on the east-west trade route. A floating, fully automated deep-water port facility on the Red Sea, a port that can handle massive supply chains, a port that sits in the same sea where Houthi attacks have already threatened global trade. Military logistics experts will tell you that a floating industrial port of this scale, in this location, could be converted for naval supply operations faster than you can get a building permit in most countries. The infrastructure is there, the deepwater access is there, the strategic position is there, and the secrecy is there too. Because one of the most telling things about NEOM is not what they are building, it is what they are hiding. There are no-fly restrictions over parts of the construction zone. Journalists cannot freely access the site. Satellite imagery shows construction progress, but the details of what is underground, what is inside the mountains, what is happening in the restricted zones, none of that is available to the public. Former employees who worked inside NEOM have described a working culture that punished anyone who raised concerns. According to internal accounts reported by the Wall Street Journal and others, when employees pushed back on impossible timelines or raised questions about the plans, they were silenced or removed. One group of former employees described the atmosphere as being like Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. Everyone could see there were problems. Nobody was allowed to say so out loud. And the audits, when they eventually leaked, confirmed something extraordinary. An internal audit of NEOM found what was described as evidence of deliberate manipulation by project managers. By 2025, new contracts had dried up. NEOM was not mentioned in Saudi Arabia's pre-budget statement for 2026. The project's total estimated cost, once listed at $6 trillion, has ballooned in some assessments to over $8 trillion, more than 25 times Saudi Arabia's entire annual government budget. The line itself, which was supposed to house 9 million people by 2045, was quietly scaled back. Instead of 170 kilometers of the full structure being complete by 2030, only 4 kilometers were now expected. Instead of 5 million residents by 2030, the revised estimate is fewer than 300,000. In October 2024, the long-serving CEO of NEOM, Nadmi Al-Nasser, was removed from his position without any official explanation of why. But the construction has not stopped. The work on the ports, the underground structures, the coastal installations, the infrastructure, none of that has stopped. When a luxury tourism project loses its CEO, misses its timelines, fails to open its first resort on schedule, watches its estimated costs explode beyond anything rational, and gets cut from the national budget, you would expect the construction to slow down dramatically or stop altogether. And in some parts of NEOM, it has slowed, but in others, work continues. And the parts where work continues the most are the parts closest to the water, the port, the coastal facilities, the infrastructure corridors. Which brings us to the people who were there before NEOM arrived. The Hawaitat tribe has lived in the Tabuk province for centuries. Their roots in this land go deeper than any government decision. They farmed it, they built on it, they raised their families on it, and they expected to grow old on it. In April 2017, the Saudi government quietly began acquiring land in the northwestern Tabuk region, including land that the Hawaitat had lived on for generations. At first, nobody told the tribe what was happening. Property transactions were frozen, rumors spread. And then in January 2020, the message came from the Tabuk government. The residents of Al-Quraiba village would be relocated, not asked, not negotiated with, told to go. And when tribe members asked how much compensation they would receive for their land, their homes, their history, the answer was $3,000 per family. $3,000 to give up the land your grandfather's grandfather was buried on. The tribe refused. Some members tried to negotiate. They were told that the Crown Prince himself had promised them involvement in NEOM's development, that their area would become famous, that they would share in the benefit. But that promise evaporated. What came instead were committees from the Justice Ministry issuing emergency acquisition orders on private land, special forces arriving to conduct raids on homes of those who resisted, and a kill order, confirmed by a former Saudi intelligence officer who later defected and spoke to Middle East Eye, that authorized lethal force against leaders who refused to leave. On the 13th of April 2020, a man named Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti posted a series of videos online. He was a tribal leader, a government employee at the Ministry of Finance, a man who simply did not want to leave his home. In those videos, he told the world that Saudi security forces were coming for him. He said he expected them to plant weapons in his house to justify what they were about to do. And then, shortly after recording those videos, he was dead. Saudi security forces said he opened fire on them and they had to neutralize him. Human rights groups, his family, and witnesses said he did not own a firearm. The UN Human Rights Council launched an investigation. The case was closed by Saudi authorities without further comment. 3 other members of the Hawaitat tribe were later tried in Saudi Arabia's specialized criminal court, the court that normally handles terrorism cases. They were convicted on charges under Saudi's counterterrorism law. The charges were linked to their activity on Twitter and their vocal opposition to forced eviction from their homes. 3 of them were sentenced to death. 3 human beings sentenced to death by a counterterrorism court for posting on social media about not wanting to leave their houses. UN special rapporteurs publicly stated that they did not believe the actions in question met the threshold for capital punishment under international law. Saudi Arabia denied any wrongdoing. Other tribe members received prison sentences of 20, 27, 35, and 50 years. An estimated 150 people from the community were arrested. Around 20,000 members of the Hawitat tribe face eventual displacement from their ancestral lands to make way for a project that its own auditors found signs of manipulation within, that has missed nearly every timeline it announced, and that its own government no longer mentions in its budget planning. You do not use a counterterrorism court to sentence protesters to death for a real estate project. You do not authorize lethal force to clear land for a hotel. You do not deploy special forces units against desert tribespeople for tourism development. But you might do all of those things to clear land for something that is much more important than any hotel. You might do all of those things if the land in question sits on top of one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate in the Middle East. If what you are building there is not primarily for tourists, if the city is a cover, and the infrastructure underneath is the point. And here is the geopolitical reality that ties all of this together. Saudi Arabia is in a dangerous neighborhood. To its south, the Houthis have been firing missiles and drones across the border for years, threatening Saudi cities, oil facilities, and airports. To its north, the entire Middle East is a powder keg of competing interests. Iran, Israel, the United States, Russia, Turkey, all circling the same region, all aware that the Red Sea is a choke point that could tip the balance of the next great conflict. Saudi Arabia is also in the middle of one of the most important political negotiations of its era, a possible normalization agreement with Israel that would reshape the entire Middle East alliance structure. And what does Israel want most in return for normalization? A U.S. security guarantee for Saudi Arabia? What does a U.S. security guarantee require? American military presence and infrastructure in the region. And where is the most strategic location for that infrastructure? Exactly where NEOM is being built. The connection between NEOM and the Saudi-Israeli normalization talks is not coincidental. Reports from Israeli newspapers have noted that Israeli companies were preparing for contracts worth billions of dollars in NEOM's development. Israeli intellectual and technological capabilities were specifically identified as something Saudi Arabia was interested in for NEOM. And this is a country that, for most of its modern history, did not even officially acknowledge Israel's existence. The fact that Israeli businesses are already lining up for NEOM contracts tells you something important about what NEOM represents beyond tourism. It represents a repositioning of Saudi Arabia in the strategic architecture of the Middle East. And now consider what that repositioning means militarily. A Saudi Arabia that is aligned with Israel, covered by a U.S. security guarantee, operating a massive port facility on the Red Sea, controlling 468 kilometers of Red Sea coastline, with underground infrastructure buried inside mountains, with a military airbase already operating 50 F-15s in the same province, with a floating industrial complex capable of naval logistics support, positioned directly across the water from Yemen, where Houthi forces are already launching attacks. That is not a tourism megaproject. That is a strategic military and economic anchor for the entire northern Red Sea corridor. That is a facility that, in a time of conflict, becomes one of the most important pieces of real estate in the world. And here's something else that nobody's talking about loud enough. NEOM covers 26,500 square kilometers. That is roughly the size of the entire state of Massachusetts. Inside that area, 95% is designated as a natural reserve, meaning it is off limits to general access, not open to the public, fenced, controlled, and watched. That is 25,175 square kilometers of controlled, restricted, access-limited territory that is formally part of the NEOM project, but has nothing in it that is being marketed to tourists. What is in that land? What is being built in those mountains, in those valleys, in those remote coastal stretches that no journalist can reach and no satellite image can clearly explain? The official answer is nature conservation. And the realistic answer is that nobody outside the Saudi government actually knows. What we do know is this. The land that NEOM sits on was taken by force from people who had lived there for centuries, using lethal force and counterterrorism courts when they refused to leave. The location chosen for NEOM is one of the most militarily sensitive pieces of land in Saudi Arabia, directly adjacent to a long-standing Saudi Air Force base that houses F-15 fighter squadrons and the entire Northwest Area Military Command. The underground structures being built inside NEOM's mountains are designed with concealed access points, hidden canals, and subterranean spaces large enough to contain entire communities. The port being built on the Red Sea coast is already handling east-west trade and is equipped with the most advanced automated crane systems in the region. The entire project sits within range of active Houthi missile systems in an ongoing regional conflict. New contracts for NEOM have dried up. It has vanished from the Saudi national budget, but construction in key areas has not stopped. And on top of all of this, the project's original CEO was removed with no explanation in October 2024, just weeks after the only part of NEOM that was publicly opened, the luxury island of Sindala, held a grand opening party that nobody was actually allowed to attend as a paying guest. As of July 2025, Sindala remains closed to the public. The party happened. The guests were invited. The champagne, or whatever they served in its place when it was poured, and then the doors closed again. And to this day, the island that was supposed to be NEOM's first proof of concept, its first real delivery to the world, sits empty, closed, uncertain. So ask yourself the honest question. What kind of project costs between 1.6 and 8? $8 trillion, misses every single timeline it sets, removes its own CEO without explanation, fails to open its first attraction to paying guests, vanishes from the national budget, and yet continues to build, continues to sink costs into port infrastructure and underground mountain facilities and coastal installations along an active military front? What project is that? A failed tourism project would stop. A failed real estate scheme would freeze. But a strategic military and geopolitical infrastructure project, one that is designed to serve Saudi Arabia's long-term defense position, Red Sea dominance, and geopolitical realignment with Israel and the United States, that project does not stop when the hotels run behind schedule. That project keeps going because the hotels were never really the point. The city of the future is a real thing. The line is real. Aquellum is real. The port of NEOM is real. The investments are real. None of this is invented. But a city can be more than one thing at the same time. A wall can be both a border and a fortress. A port can be both a trade hub and a naval logistics base. A mountain can be both a luxury retreat and a bunker. And a megacity can be both a tourism destination and the most strategically important piece of real estate a country has built in a generation. Saudi Arabia is not hiding a military base inside NEOM the way a spy hides a message in a letter. It is not a secret compartment, a trapdoor, or covert black site. What Saudi Arabia has done is something far more elegant and far more difficult to challenge. It has built a city so extraordinary, so expensive, so visually breathtaking, and so boldly ambitious that the entire world has been focused on the glass walls and the architect's renders and the promise of 9 million people living in a straight line through the desert. And while the world watched the marketing, Saudi Arabia has been quietly doing what it has always done in Tabuk province, consolidating the most powerful military position in its northwestern frontier, extending its reach across the Red Sea, burrowing into the mountains that line the Gulf of Aqaba, and building infrastructure that will matter far more in the next 20 years than any hotel room or ski resort ever could. The future they are building is real. The question is, whose future is it for? Because the tribe members who posted videos from their homes saying they did not want to leave, they had a future too. Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti had a future. His brother Shadli had a future before he was sentenced to death for posting about forced eviction on social media. The 20,000 Hawitat people who are still waiting to know where they will end up, they had a future, and none of their futures made it into the press release. None of their faces appeared in the digital renders. None of their names are on the architect's blueprints. They were simply the price of building the new future, the cost that the brochures never show, the story that the glass walls were designed to hide. The megacity is rising. The mountains are being hollowed out. The port cranes are moving cargo across the Red Sea. The F-15s are still flying out of King Faisal Air Base just down the road. The underground canal waits behind its concealed entrance inside the mountain. The Red Sea shimmers under the sun, and somewhere out there on those same waters, Houthi drones are still circling. And Saudi Arabia's most extraordinary construction project, the most expensive, the most secretive, the most militarily positioned city ever proposed by a government that has long kept its military ambitions behind closed doors, is still being built, one layer at a time, one mountain at a time, one announcement that almost nobody questions at a time. They called it the new future. Maybe it is. But every future has a foundation. And the foundation of this one was built on land that was taken by force, in a location chosen for its military value, with infrastructure that serves purposes that have never been fully explained to the world. That is not the story of a dream. That is the story of a strategy. And now that you know it, you will never see those mirrored walls the same way again.